August 15, 1940, Luftwaffe Airfield, northern France. Hauptmann Werner Mulders stood beside his Messerschmitt Bf 109, staring at the mission board in disbelief. This was his third sortie of the day, and like the previous two, British fighters had been waiting at altitude exactly where his formation would arrive. Not approximately where. Exactly where. "They know we're coming," his wingman muttered. "Every single time they're already there, at our altitude, positioned perfectly, waiting." Mulders had flown in Spain, in Poland, in France. He'd faced the best pilots Europe could offer. But this was different. The British weren't reacting to German attacks. They were anticipating them with impossible precision. His formation crossed the English coast at 15,000 feet. Within 2 minutes, Spitfires dove from above, again positioned perfectly, again waiting in ambush. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. Mulders lost 3 aircraft before retreating back across the channel. Landing at base, he confronted his squadron intelligence officer. "How are they doing this? Do we have a spy? Are they breaking our codes?" The officer shook his head grimly. "It's worse than that. They can see us. Somehow, from the ground, they can see aircraft 100 miles away. Our bombers, our fighters, everything. They track us from takeoff to landing. The British call it radar, and we have no counter for it." That night, 5 Luftwaffe pilots in Mulders' squadron requested reassignment to other duties. By September 1940, German air crews were reporting for missions, knowing the British would be waiting. Morale collapsed. And the Battle of Britain, the campaign that was supposed to destroy the RAF in 2 weeks, dragged into a grinding war of attrition Germany couldn't win. Britain's invisible eye had seen them coming, and it changed warfare forever. Britain's radar network, officially called Chain Home, was the world's first integrated air defense system, and in 1940 it was magic indistinguishable from witchcraft to those facing it. The concept emerged from desperate 1930s research. British scientists knew that radio waves bounced off metal objects. The question was whether this could detect aircraft at useful ranges. In February 1935, Robert Watson Watt demonstrated that radio pulses could detect a bomber at 8 miles. The Air Ministry, recognizing war was inevitable, immediately funded expansion. By 1938, Britain was constructing massive radar stations along its eastern and southern coasts. Chain Home stations were impossible to miss. Steel towers 350 feet tall, holding arrays of antennas that transmitted powerful radio pulses. When these pulses hit aircraft, a tiny fraction reflected back. By measuring the time between transmission and echo, operators could calculate range with remarkable accuracy. But the towers weren't the real innovation. The genius was integration. Each Chain Home station fed data to Fighter Command's central operations room at Bentley Priory. Plotters, mostly young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, marked incoming raids on massive map tables. Controllers directed fighter squadrons to intercept based on real-time information. The British had created something unprecedented, a system where defenders could see attackers 100-plus miles away, calculate their course and speed, and position fighters for optimal interception, all before German bombers even reached the coast. Chain Home's effectiveness stemmed from systematic integration of technology and tactics. The network consisted of 20 main stations and 30 smaller installations by September 1940, creating overlapping coverage along Britain's entire eastern and southern coastline. Each station could detect aircraft at ranges of 100-120 miles, providing 15 to 20 minutes warning before raiders reached British airspace. This warning time was revolutionary. RAF fighters could scramble, climb to altitude, and position for attack while German formations were still over the channel. Luftwaffe pilots expecting surprise attacks instead found Spitfires and Hurricanes waiting at superior altitude and position. The psychological impact was devastating. German bomber crews reported the eerie sensation of being watched, invisible eyes tracking every movement. Fighter escorts launched diversionary sweeps, attempting to draw off British interceptors, only to watch RAF fighters ignore the feints and position perfectly for the main bomber stream. Luftwaffe intelligence knew about Chain-Home's existence. The towers were visible from reconnaissance aircraft. But they fundamentally misunderstood the system's capability and, critically, failed to recognize its integration with fighter control. German analysts believed radar provided general warning of approaching raids, useful but not decisive. They didn't grasp that British controllers were directing individual fighter squadrons to specific intercept points based on continuous radar tracking. This intelligence failure proved catastrophic. The strategic asymmetry was brutal. RAF Fighter Command operated with near-perfect information. Luftwaffe commanders operated blind. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, used radar data to practice calculated economy of force. Rather than maintaining standing patrols, which exhausted pilots and wasted fuel, he kept fighters on the ground until radar detected incoming raids, then scrambled only the squadrons necessary for interception. This meant RAF fighters were always fresh, always had fuel for extended combat, and almost always achieved positional advantage before engagement. German formations, by contrast, flew blind. Bomber crews never knew if RAF fighters would intercept. They simply had to assume British fighters might appear at any moment. The constant tension, the impossibility of surprise, the certainty that the enemy somehow knew their position, it eroded morale week by week. Flight Lieutenant Peter Townsend, flying Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain, later described the advantage. "We knew they were coming before they'd crossed the French coast. We knew their altitude, their heading, their approximate numbers. We'd climb to advantageous position and wait. They never saw us until we attacked. It wasn't courage, it was having eyes when the enemy was blind." The numbers reflect this advantage. During July-October 1940, the RAF achieved roughly 1.5.1 kill ratio against the Luftwaffe, destroying German aircraft faster than they could be replaced while preserving sufficient British fighter strength to maintain defense. Without radar, historical analysis suggests the ratio would have reversed to perhaps 1.2 in Germany's favor, meaning RAF Fighter Command would have been destroyed by September 1940, leaving Britain defenseless. Germany possessed radar technology. Their Freya and Würzburg systems were technically sophisticated. But Luftwaffe leadership failed to understand radar's strategic potential. German radar stations were deployed defensively around Germany and occupied Europe for night fighter control and flak direction. Excellent tactical applications, but they missed the strategic revolution Britain had achieved. The Luftwaffe never created an integrated air defense system comparable to Chain-Home and Fighter Command. German radar stations operated independently, communicating with local flak batteries or individual night fighter controllers, but never feeding data to a central operations room that could coordinate nationwide defense. This organizational failure stemmed from doctrinal blindness. German military thinking emphasized offense, lightning strikes, concentrated force, aggressive action. The meticulous, patient, defensive integration that characterized British radar employment seemed passive and un-German. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, famously dismissed radar as a British obsession with defensive gadgets. This attitude persisted even as the Battle of Britain demonstrated radar's decisive value. By the time Germany attempted to build integrated air defense, 1943-1944, responding to Allied strategic bombing, the RAF and USAAF had developed radar countermeasures, chaff, jamming, deception, that degraded German radar effectiveness. Britain had a 3-year head start, and Germany never caught up. Chain-Home's effectiveness depended entirely on the hundreds of Women's Auxiliary Air Force plotters, who translated raw radar data into actionable intelligence. Inside filter rooms at sector stations, WAAF operators received telephone reports from radar stations. Raid 47, bearing 095, range 80 miles, Angels 15, strength 20 plus. Plotters translated this into markers on map tables, colored counters showing raid position, heading, altitude, and estimated strength. As raids moved, plotters updated positions every few minutes, creating a real-time picture of the air battle developing over southern England. Controllers, RAF officers observing from balconies above the plotting tables, used this information to scramble squadrons, assign vectors for interception, and coordinate multiple engagements simultaneously. The system required extraordinary discipline and accuracy. A plotting error could send fighters to empty sky while bombers struck undefended cities. The pressure was immense. Young women, often barely 20 years old, making decisions that meant life or death for pilots and civilians. WAAF Corporal Vera Watkins, working at Bentley Priory's filter room throughout 1940, later recalled, "We knew the pilots' voices on the radio. We tracked their squadrons, watched them intercept raids, saw some counters disappear, meaning aircraft lost. Then we'd hear which pilots didn't return. It was deeply personal. We weren't just pushing markers on a table. We were trying to save lives, our pilots, our civilians. The responsibility was crushing, but we never hesitated. Britain's survival depended on us being perfect every time." Adlertag, Eagle Day, was supposed to be the Luftwaffe's knockout blow. Göring planned massive coordinated strikes to destroy RAF Fighter Command in a single day. Instead, it demonstrated radar's decisive advantage. German formations assembled over France at dawn. Chain Home detected them immediately, tracking buildup, estimating strength, predicting targets. Fighter Command scrambled squadrons in calculated sequence, positioning interceptors for maximum effect. The first German wave, 80 bombers escorted by 60 fighters, crossed the coast expecting surprise. Instead, 6 RAF squadrons were waiting at altitude. The engagement began 40 miles from the intended target. German bombers jettisoned loads and retreated. The second wave suffered worse. Radar tracking allowed Fighter Command to identify the main effort and concentrate forces. German bombers reached their targets but faced overwhelming fighter opposition. Losses mounted. By day's end, the Luftwaffe had flown over 1,400 sorties, an exhausting operational effort. But RAF fighters had intercepted major raids at optimal positions, inflicting disproportionate casualties while preserving British strength. Luftwaffe intelligence had predicted destroying 50-plus British fighters. Actual British losses, 13 fighters. German bomber crews returned to French bases demoralized and confused. How had the British been ready? How had RAF fighters known exactly where to intercept? How could Germany win when the enemy seemed able to read German minds? The answer, radar, was literally staring them in the face from those massive towers across the channel. But Luftwaffe leadership refused to believe ground-based technology could be so decisive. September 15, 1940, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, was the day German aircrews broke psychologically. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids, 200-plus bombers in the morning, 150-plus in the afternoon. Both formations were detected 100 miles out, tracked continuously, and intercepted by perfectly positioned RAF squadrons. German bomber crews watched British fighters appear seemingly from nowhere, always at advantageous position, always in strength, always knowing exactly where the raid was headed. The impossibility of achieving surprise, the certainty of interception, the growing losses. It shattered belief in victory. Oberst Johannes Fink, commanding bomber wings, reported that evening, "Our crews are exhausted and demoralized. They know the British are waiting. They know surprise is impossible. Many believe the enemy has supernatural ability to detect our approach. Morale is critically low. I request immediate operational pause." Göring refused the pause, but the damage was done. German aircrew confidence had collapsed. Pilots began reporting illness to avoid missions. Crews discussed sabotaging their own aircraft to prevent operations. The Luftwaffe flew 56 more days of Battle of Britain operations, but September 15th was the psychological breaking point. Radar had won a battle of morale before the final military outcome was decided. Britain's radar victory had consequences far beyond the Battle of Britain. Invasion cancelled. Hitler postponed, then abandoned Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. Without air superiority, which radar made impossible, amphibious invasion was suicidal. Eastern Front timing. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, 6 months later than optimal. Delay partly stemmed from prolonged Battle of Britain and need to secure the Western Front. Those 6 months meant German forces reached Moscow in November, winter, rather than September. The delay arguably saved the Soviet Union. American confidence, British survival, enabled by radar, convinced America that Britain could resist Germany long enough to justify Lend-Lease support. Radar's invisible contribution to Britain's survival altered American strategic calculations. Bomber War Foundation, RAF's successful air defense, allowed Britain to build bomber forces that eventually devastated German industry. Without radar preserving Britain in 1940, there would have been no 1943-1945 strategic bombing campaign. Radar didn't just win the Battle of Britain, it altered the war's entire trajectory. Chain Home was the first information warfare system, the first time data collection, analysis, and decision-making were integrated into real-time command and control. Every modern air defense system, American AWACS, Russian S-400, Israeli Iron Dome, descends directly from Watson-Watt's 1935 experiments and Dowding's 1940 integrated air defense. But the legacy extends beyond military technology. Chain Home demonstrated that information superiority could overcome material disadvantages. Britain had fewer fighters, less industrial capacity, smaller pilot pools, yet won decisively because they could see while Germany flew blind. This principle, information as strategic advantage, defines modern warfare. From GPS-guided munitions to drone operations to cyber warfare, contemporary military power rests on knowing what the enemy is doing before they know you know. Britain's 1940 radar network was the proof of concept for information-age warfare. Chain Home killed perhaps 2,000 German airmen directly. Aircraft shot down because radar positioned British fighters for optimal interception. But it defeated 100,000 more psychologically, pilots who flew missions knowing the enemy could see them coming, knowing surprise was impossible, knowing each mission might end with Spitfires diving from the sun because invisible eyes had watched their approach from 100 miles away. Werner Milders survived the Battle of Britain, scored 101 victories, and died in a 1941 aircraft accident. Before his death, he wrote about the summer of 1940. "We never solved the radar problem. Every mission, we knew British fighters would be waiting. The technological advantage was absolute. We could outfly them individually, but we couldn't outthink their system. That's when I understood Germany would lose, because our enemies could see the future, and we were blind." That was radar's true legacy. The moment when technology created information asymmetry so profound that courage, skill, and determination became secondary to the simple ability to see what was coming. German pilots didn't refuse to fly because they were cowards. They refused because continuing was pointless, flying into battles where the enemy knew you were coming, where you'd always be outnumbered, because they could calculate exactly how many fighters to scramble, where tactical surprise was impossible because invisible eyes watched from beyond the horizon. Britain's radar network proved a fundamental truth of modern warfare. You can't win if you can't see. And once you can see, your enemy's courage becomes irrelevant against your knowledge. The towers are long gone, dismantled decades ago, but their descendants watch the skies today. AWACS aircraft, phased array radars, satellite surveillance, all extensions of that desperate 1935 experiment when Robert Watson Watt asked, "Can radio waves see aircraft?" They could. And that ability to see the invisible changed warfare, changed history, and ensured that when the Eagles came, Britain was ready, watching, waiting, and seeing everything.